You're listening to the Baha'i World News Service.
In this episode, we are joined by representatives from offices of the Baha'i international community as they explore insights about social cohesion drawn from the experiences of Baha'i communities worldwide. We hear from Rochelle Bayani from the Brussels office.
We've been thinking, what is the role of a community in fostering an environment where people learn to let go of their prejudice and really to see one another as one.
Simin Fahandij from the Geneva office.
I think social cohesion really starts actually at the level of the individual and how we look at each other.
Hatem El Hadi from the Cairo office.
How can every member of the community and every member of society feel that they have the space and the right and the duty to contribute to the advancement of the whole?
And Salim Vaillancourt from the New York office.
We're not just hoping for multiculturalism, we're trying to actually learn from each other and build something new.
From the Baha'i World News Service, this is In Conversation, a podcast series that explores experiences from Baha'i efforts to contribute to social progress, from the grassroots to the international level.
The Baha'i communities around the world and the BIC and what it contributes in the various places that it operates is always trying to think about this idea of participation and inclusion. So I know my colleagues in New York have been working with various very prominent figures in the international community, and they've been exploring this idea of inclusivity, the need, the responsibility to include people of any and every background.
I think there's one underlying principle that institutions in particular, but of course community and individual, need to be based on, which is the idea that the well-being of one depends on the well-being of all. How would these governing institutions that are essentially making very far-reaching decisions for all of us, for countries, for nations, for people in these nations, how would these change? How would the relationship between individuals change if we thought of the well-being of us depending on the well-being of everyone else? And I think this is the kind of world we want to imagine, the kind of institutions that we are perhaps trying to help contribute to rebuilding in our work.
I think that's a question we've been thinking about. How do institutions for instance, at the European or at the international level, encourage social cohesion at the grassroots? And I think we have a lot to learn there, because somehow, in many ways, the grassroots is removed from continental policy making. But then we realize that we have to find ways to organize our societies so that the insights of the grassroots can really inform policy making at the regional or international level, and vice versa, that policy making at that level can really see how can they foster a living together at the grassroots. And one element in that is the municipalities. They're sort of the next institutional level. The closest from the grassroots is the municipality. And so a lot of thought needs to go into what role do municipalities play when it comes to fostering social cohesion. And for instance, at the European level, we see that there are many networks of mayors and of cities who really coming together and asking themselves that question, because they see that a lot of the challenges that they're trying to address, they cannot address alone. They need, on one hand, the individual, and they need the community to be able to address these challenges. And universal participation comes into play. How do you ensure that everyone can contribute to the creation of these joint plans?
How do you bring an expression of social cohesion into the legislative systems? When you bring the legislation in, you're talking about how can we have inclusive citizenship? How can every member of the community and every member of society feel that they have the space and the right and the duty to contribute to the advancement of the whole.
That's interesting. It would be worth thinking about maybe the extent to which an institution such as a legislature or a government can help pursue that as a goal, and then also at what point those institutions have to give way to communities, for example, or individuals or other parts of society in pursuing that.
I think it's a very interesting question. I'm just looking at the European context. So, for example, the European institutions in 2020 adopted the first European anti-racism action plan. And they also appointed the first anti-racism coordinator at the European level. And the action plan foresees that member states should also adopt a national action plan. And the action plan itself, of course, has a series of legislative measures in it, or foresees the adoption of legislative measures that fight different expressions of prejudice and racism, including hate speech, for instance. But then the action plan itself says that, of course, something else needs to happen. It's not enough just to adopt legislation to fight racism, for instance. And so we've been thinking, what is it that also needs to happen beyond that? And how do the grassroots come into that? And what is the role of a community in fostering an environment where people learn to let go of their prejudice and really to see one another as one, rather than to conceptualize each other as us and them. And that understanding of oneness is also fostered when people are able to interact. It's often difficult to sort of create that understanding in environments where there's no interaction between people. And again, in cities, the way life happens, and also the fact there's so many different populations on a small geographical space, but there's no real and meaningful interaction. And so one of the questions we've really explored is like, what is a meaningful interaction? Does it mean we occasionally meet? Is it, for example, I don't know, mothers just sort of seeing each other in the supermarket? Is that meaningful? But then, no, there is something else that needs to happen. Meaningful is when then a conversation happens, a conversation between people that are able to tap into each other's experience and to really understand who the other person is and how the other person operates and thinks, and then see that as wealth and not just as a challenge that needs to be overcome.
So I can jump in there as well with a few thoughts from the Arab region. For us, we started to explore the topic of coexistence, and I think that was our entry point into social cohesion, if you will. We examined it at the level of interfaith dialogue, where we thought about how would faith-based community leaders come together and explore the role of religion in society, and how that role, which is quite, let's say, influential in our part of the world, how that role can really be adapted and explored in order to realize greater social cohesion and identify the elements of unity that exist in all religions. Another level that we start to explore also is amongst intellectuals. So you see this in cultural saloons in certain parts of the Arab world. And you also see this in what is already existing as a social construct called the majlis, or a space in which people come together and have conversations about whatever concerns they might have in their community. This is a typical way where people come together and just sit around and explore, any topics of interest. Sometimes it's simply a social conversation, but sometimes there is a theme around which people converse. And in one of the countries, for example, we have a couple of majlises that have been identified as majlis for coexistence, where people come together and explore that specific topic and elements relating to social cohesion. Another space that we started to explore this in also is with other social actors, such as with some government institutions in some certain areas. Some government entities wanted to explore what is the role of education in fostering the sense of coexistence within a society and social cohesion at that level. Some other spaces explore the role of media in fostering coexistence. And so these are the spaces that we're exploring and learning with like-minded or people who are interested, let's say, in this topic, to try and learn about what does that mean in our part of the world.
Yeah, and another area that our office has been looking at is actually the role of media in social cohesion, which has been very interesting. There are, of course, many aspects to the role of media in building social cohesion. You can look at the role of, for example, tech companies with social media. You can look at the role of traditional media. You know, there are so many ways where media influences, shapes the narratives, the conceptions we have about ourselves and about one another, one another as individuals, but also as communities. And we held an event actually looking at the role of tech companies in social cohesion. And I think this idea that tech companies have a responsibility. So just to give you an example, like when we go on social media algorithms essentially dictate what we see, what we read, what we consume. Social media algorithms are built at the moment in a way to make us scroll, for example, to read more of what we have already read. So encouraging confirmation bias, for example. And so I think we've been looking at how can all of this be redesigned, how can social media algorithms be redesigned so that they're actually encouraging people to have constructive dialogue with one another online in online spaces.
Yeah, I suppose digital social cohesion then also affects and influences the way people act in their local context as well. So that's interesting. Also, what you said reminded me of a journalist at the Baha'i community in the US who wrote a book on conflict and trying to understand why different communities fell into intractable forms of conflict. And one of her findings was about the way communities are represented. And this goes back to what you were talking about, Rochelle, in particular, that if a community is represented just as having problems and being unable to get out of its problems and just being beset in this context of misery, then that is perpetuated. But if a community is shown as actively trying to address its problems, even if its attempts don't work out in the first few instances, just being portrayed, represented, being seen and understood as being a protagonist, as being active, as taking agency and responsibility, changes the perception of that community of itself, and then helps them become more active again in trying to pursue the change they want. So it really goes to this idea of people seeing themselves and living in a context where they're encouraged to see each other as active, as engaged, as having a role, having a unique contribution.
Drawing insights from Baha'i community building efforts throughout the world, Rochelle explores how communities can embrace diversity and recognize every individual as a protagonist in society's advancement.
I think there's many ways of understanding this notion of social cohesion, but the way we sort of are looking at it now in the European context is really basically how do you create these communities at the grassroots level that are communities where people of different backgrounds and cultures that usually do not really interact, how do they not just live side by side, but come together, find ways to reflect together about the setting in which they live, their neighborhood or their village, and then try and work together towards the transformation of that neighborhood. There's several ways in creating that. And one is that this notion that what is the posture that we adopt when people just arrive? For instance, often we're speaking about sort of this concept of integration. But the word integration in some ways means you take something and put it into something existing. And that in itself maybe needs revisiting, because somebody who's just arrived, rather than putting them into something existing, maybe we see them as somebody that we can learn together with about what it means to build a new society, rather than having them come and learn from a society that already exists. And we know no society is perfect, so we would want to learn together with others how to build a new society. And you know it in theory, but you see it on a daily basis when you interact with people at the grassroots, is really this notion that everyone has capacity. And that we need to conceptualize everyone as being filled with capacity. And the way sometimes people are seen is through this lens of deficit. So for example, we're thinking of somebody who's newly arrived, we're thinking of them as somebody who does not speak the language yet.
Yes.
Rather than thinking of them as somebody who already speaks another language and is in the process of learning a second one. So for instance, the mother that is working, I don't know, or the father that is working 2 jobs and is raising his children at the same time, that is to be seen as a very, very resilient and resourceful person that we can learn from. And so this notion of service then comes in. How do we create environments, and how can community be communities where anyone who arrives is immediately thought of as somebody with capacity and can be of service and has a space that allows them to really explore together with others how it is that they can serve and contribute to where they've arrived.
It's interesting that actually the different threads of the conversation seem to be coming together a little bit. You know, this what you said before also about immigration into European contexts, and how there are these existing models of what that means. And so we have multiculturalism, we have assimilation, and it sounds like what Baha'i communities and the people that Baha'is live amongst and work with are trying to identify a new model, and that's quite a leap forward, where we're not just hoping for multiculturalism, and it's certainly not assimilation. We're trying to actually learn from each other and build something new. And then, of course, at the more global scale, I think we're suddenly starting to appreciate that this is the grassroots action that percolates upward over time, probably over generations, to create new ways of thinking. So it feels like, and of course, as Baha'is, as a Baha'i community, we're very upfront about the fact that we're at very early stages of this. We're learning how to do this along with many other people.
Yeah, I was just thinking as colleagues were talking that what are the prerequisites that need to exist in a community or in society to be able to welcome new arrivals and people who are coming. And I think one aspect of it is really thinking about this idea of diversity. When we talk about diversity, we sometimes maybe think about tolerating each other and coexisting in the same space, in the same place. But I think this idea of unity and diversity goes beyond even tolerance. You know, this idea of, well, we should all be able to live in one place and be okay with each other and allow each other to live as long as we're not hurting one another. But I think this idea that we are talking about today, social cohesion, is really thinking about how we can together build a better society. So working together, act proactively for the building of a better community, better society.
In terms of the importance of creating spaces for learning and reflection, I think, you know, if we approach any collective issue, whether at the grassroots level or at the global level, if we approach it with the attitude that we already have an answer, then we already, you know, lost that battle. And I think one of the things we're learning at the grassroots level at the Baha'i community, and we try to, as much as possible, share these experiences, is this process of establishing a regular reflection meetings. So the Baha'i community is learning about how to foster and create vibrant and unified communities at the grassroots level. And in order to learn about this process, they are, every few months, they'll get together and have a reflection about what learnings have they gained from the experiences that they might have had. And I think this process in itself, as simple as it might sound, it's quite profound and has been a source of great insights.
I think social cohesion might also seem like a very big abstract idea for many people, but I think social cohesion really starts actually at the level of the individual and how we look at each other, the attitude that we have about one another. And I think really this question of identity, for example, and how do we look at each other first and foremost as human beings, which is really our primary identity, regardless of who we are, where we come from, our background, our ethnicity, our gender. Really, our first and primary identity is a human being. And the secondary identity is really the background that we come from, the ethnicity, our color, our race. And so I think really when we talk about social cohesion, it actually, everyone on some level is involved in fostering social cohesion. So every time we befriend someone or create a friendship with someone from another background, from another country, that where we really see one another as one, we're already fostering this idea of social cohesion.
Yeah, and this is also something that as Baha'i community, I think we're trying to learn about the educational programs that we have that helps us to reflect on principles, on concepts, and also to develop skills that are necessary to create social cohesion, are part and parcel of developing that capacity for the individual.
Yeah. So I think in order to build capacity, the Baha'is are trying to build an educational model, a moral educational model, where young people, children and junior youth, people who are preteen and teenagers, are together learning about self-expression, about critical thought, and developing these capacities in the context of, with reference to values such as the oneness of humanity, such as the need to consult in a community, and the equality of men and women, and all these kinds of principles that the Baha'i faith puts forward.
Yeah, and I think we have to recognize that every single person that was created on this earth was created noble and was created to help advance a civilization that is both spiritually and materially prosperous, that is on this earth to help build better communities for themselves and for those around them. And I think once we have that recognition of the nobility of the human being, then everything else in a way will fall into place. All of these different ideas and principles that we've been exploring today will fall into place. The role of the individual, the role of the community, the role of the institutions. And in a way, this is in the UN Charter, that every human being is created equally and is created noble. And I think as a humanity, as individuals, as communities, as institutions, we need to actually go back to the basics, to this principle of human beings being created noble, and to really think about that together, about what it really truly means for ourselves and for our societies.
You've been listening to In Conversation, a podcast series from the Baha'i World News Service. For more podcasts and stories, visit news.baha'i.org.